A war-torn fort harboring ghostly soldiers, a quaint forest lodge whose halls are roamed by the dead, and an iconic battleship filled by restless spirits lost in wars long since past await on this journey through some more of North Carolina's most haunted places. Let's jump right in. Hey guys, and thanks for joining me on this adventure through some more of North Carolina's most haunted places. Recognized for its strong ties to the very forming of the United States, as the birthplace of aviation, for its breathtaking natural landscapes, unparalleled barbecue, thriving coastal life, and more, the Tar Heel State is also saturated in a mess of classic ghost stories and chilling old hill folklore, depicting some pretty frightening supernatural phenomena. Are you sure you're ready to get started? Our first haunt takes us to the southeastern coast of North Carolina, to the iconic Fort Fisher. Fort Fisher, which is set in New Hanover County in North Carolina, is a Civil War era fortification that, during its time in operation, served the Confederacy, that today acts as a popular historic site which draws in countless tourists each year, and its bounds are shrouded in a number of chilling ghost stories and tales of restless spirits resulting from the conflict that transpired so long ago. Historically, the first artillery batteries to be constructed on Fort Fisher grounds would go up through the spring of 1861 under the direction of Major Charles Pattison Bowles. Over subsequent months, additional batteries and fortifications would be added, and by September of the same year, the site was officiated as Fort Fisher and derived its name from Colonel Charles F. Fisher of the 6th North Carolinian Infantry, who fell in the First Battle of Manassas. Through the bulk of the war, Fort Fisher would protect trade routes through the port of Wilmington and would enable the transit of supplies to Confederate forces inland from there until the 1864 fall of Mobile, Alabama, after which Union forces planned to seize Wilmington in order to further cut Confederate supply lines. On December 24th of 1864, the First Battle of Fort Fisher would transpire, when the Union attacked from the sea, enabling the landing of troops which were thwarted shortly afterwards by the arrival of Confederate Major General Robert Hoke's division, resulting in a combined casualty count of somewhere from 700 to 1,000 men. Following this failed siege, nearly a month later, the Second Battle of Fort Fisher would pop off on January 12th of 1865, and this time, Union forces were able to breach the fort, after which they made quick work of those inside. Following the fall of Fort Fisher and the subsequent fall of Fort Anderson, Confederate General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was left without supplies, and on February 22nd of 1865, the Union would definitively occupy Wilmington. As the years droned on, Fort Fisher was recognized unofficially for its significance through the war and was visited by countless tourists. In 1961, it was finally declared a National Historic Landmark with a museum established immediately after, and in 1966, the expanse was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Fort Fisher remains a popular travel destination to this day, with its museum offering a map of the battlefield in 1865 complete with three-dimensional models, fiber optic lighting, and full narration, alongside a host of other exhibits that showcase things like what life was like at the fort, how the battle played out, and various clothing, weapons, gear, and more. Additionally, the site offers touring options that take visitors around surviving earthworks, and on special occasions, its 32-pound Seacoast cannon is still fired off in ceremony. Reports of ghostly activity at Fort Fisher aren't a new phenomenon, and some of the first documentation of otherworldly happenings transpired in as early as 1900, when visitors began citing a spectral sentinel in the nearby forests, standing guard over a pine grove. To this date, the Sentinel of Fort Fisher has been spied countless times, and always fades away when approached. Also reported across fort grounds are disembodied bootsteps, the phantom sounds of gun and cannon fire, and instances of locked or barred doors opening by themselves, and a handful of accounts tell of ghostly ships sighted sailing the nearby waters, that have even been witnessed unloading onto the old defense, causing those present to scatter or duck for cover, only for no impacts to be made, and for the ships to promptly disappear into thin air. Photography and video taken around the fort commonly captures orbs or skewed silhouettes in the backgrounds. Personal electronics brought on site have been known to go haywire, and inexplicable temperature fluctuations are often recorded, with changes as drastic as nearly 70 degrees Fahrenheit dropping suddenly to a chilly 40 degrees, and an entity matching the description of Confederate Colonel William Lamb, who was stationed at the fort during the war, has been sighted from time to time, with some claiming his spirit returned to the place that changed the course of his life forever. Our second haunt lands us on the western end of North Carolina and has us checking in at the historic Omni Grove Park Inn. The Omni Grove Park Inn, which is located up in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Asheville, North Carolina, is a historic resort lodging that's played host to a range of presidents, dignitaries, celebrities, and other high-profile names throughout history, and its sprawling bounds are rumored to harbor chilling hauntings and strong paranormal activity. Historically, planning for the Omni Grove Park Inn was initially started in 1909 when Edwin Wiley Grove and his son-in-law Fred Seeley purchased close to 400 acres near Sunset Mountain for the purpose of designing a grand resort. And after rejecting several different architects' plans, Seeley, who had no formal training, actually sketched out the first blueprints for his lodging, after which construction was started and the site was officially opened on July 12th of 1913. Over the years, the inn would grow rapidly in popularity and would welcome a number of prominent guests. During this time, amidst the 1930s, Great Gatsby author F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda would actually move to Asheville, with Zelda receiving more intensive care for her mental health issues, while Scott actually resided at the inn for about a year while dealing with his own health issues, alcoholism, and tuberculosis. Through World War II, the property would be occupied by military forces, and the site would be used at first as an internment center for Axis diplomats, who would reside there while being allowed guarded trips into town for the purchase of local goods and services. Notably, this was actually a blessing to the hard-hit economy, and money brought in by these diplomats allowed for the locale to soldier on. Later, from 1944 to 1945, the hotel would go on to host an Army redistribution center, where soldiers could partake in a little R&R before assignment to their next operations. Through the mid-1950s, and amidst the Cold War, the US Supreme Court would heavily consider using the old inn as a bunker site. In 1955, the Grove Park Inn would be acquired as part of Sammons Enterprises, and from 1958 to 1963, owner Charles Sammons would invest $100,000 into an assortment of restorations and renovations, all the while promoting the historic site. On a side note, during this same time, Charles's wife Elaine was a frequent visitor to the hotel and would actually sneak their dog in under the cover of a baby carriage. Later still, in 1982 and again in 88, $65 million was spent in order to construct the Sammons and Vanderbilt wings, alongside a 50,000 square foot sports center, more than tripling the inn's total guest room count. More recently, in 1992, the National Gingerbread House competition was started at the inn and actually continues into the present. In 2001, a $44 million, 3,700 square foot spa was added to the property. In 2012, KSL Resorts would acquire the property for $120 million, and in 2013, KSL would resell the site to Omni, after which, in 2018, they would open the Seeley Pavilion event venue. In the present, the Omni Grove Park Inn remains open to the public, offering lavish accommodations, a range of events, tours, historic displays, unparalleled dining and drink options, and much, much more. But over its many years, the Grove Park Inn has harbored another reputation, a much darker one, pertaining to its purported slew of ghostly hauntings. And both staff and visitors to its bounds have reported doors that open and close on their own, strange commotions heard from rooms that should be vacant, and instances of personal electronics behaving erratically or outright dying, even on full charges. Informal investigations of the property have yielded high EMF levels, chilling EVPs, and hits on thermal grids, while others have told of shadowy figures sighted slinking through the halls after dark, that some have even described as aggressive or as chasing them at great lengths before fading away. Easily the most famous hotel ghost story tells that sometime through the 1920s, a young woman fell from a 5th-story balcony and died right on the Palm Court floor. Shortly after this tragedy, both guests and employees begin reporting encounters with the apparition of this woman, always clad in a pink dress, sometimes roaming the hallways, at others lounging around the lobby, and at others still replaying her final fall from that 5th story, only to vanish right at the moment of would-be impact. Now recognized as the Pink Lady, encounters with her likeness continue to this very day, with a surprising number of reports sprouting up each year. Lastly, several guests have told of leaving their rooms for only moments and returning to find their luggage packed or unpacked, their water faucets pouring, and their TVs turned on, while others have reported being awakened in the middle of the night to a pressure at the feet of their beds, as if someone or something unseen is sitting there. Shooting back over to the state's southern coast, number 3 has us booking a tour aboard the legendary USS North Carolina. The USS North Carolina, or BB-55, which is moored just across from historic downtown Wilmington, North Carolina, is a historic vessel that was actually constructed as the first of its type of ship to be used by the US Navy, that acted as a battleship and has since been turned into a historic landmark, memorial, and educational attraction, which has grown in fame amongst historians and tourists, and in infamy amongst paranormal investigators and dark tourists for several high-profile hauntings experienced on deck. Historically, BB-55's keel was initially laid on October 27th of 1937 within the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn, New York, marking the creation of the first battleship constructed in 16 years. And it was actually so immense that its completion required the entire building be lengthened and straightened. Following the building process, the USS North Carolina would become the first of the fast battleships to join the fleet in World War II. On June 13th of 1940, she would be launched from the Navy Yard into the East River, and on April 9th of 1941, she would be commissioned under a widely publicized and highly anticipated ceremony. On December 7th of 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor would transpire, after which the US would declare war on Japan and Germany, and BB-55 was ordered to the Pacific Theater of Operations, arriving in 1942 at Pearl Harbor. Notably, the prestigious vessel would go on to serve in every major naval offensive across the Pacific, earning no less than 15 stars in the process, while marking her as the highest decorated American battleship in the history of World War II. Following the war, in 1947, BB-55 was decommissioned in New York, and while during her retirement the Navy would consider a handful of projects aimed at modernizing or converting the ship for other purposes, including a 1954 study designed to improve her speed to 31 knots by way of reducing displacement and increasing propulsion, and a later proposal to completely transform the vessel into a helicopter carrier by way of removing her main and secondary guns, in exchange for a flight deck that would fit up to 28 helicopters and a battery of 16 3-inch guns. Ultimately, it was discovered that the construction of a new dedicated ship for these purposes was actually more cost-effective, and these earlier plans were eventually scrapped. Even following her decommissioning, the USS North Carolina would remain in the Navy's inventory until June of 1960, after which she was slated to be broken up for scrap. However, concern over the loss of this historic and decorated battleship would arise, and eventually, a campaign was started to save the vessel, and would result in funding of $250,000 designed to preserve BB-55 as a museum ship that would be moored where else but in Wilmington. In 1961, the ship was pulled by a group of 9 tugboats from Bayonne, New Jersey to Wilmington, after which, in 1962, it was opened as a museum. Through the early 1980s, the Navy would reactivate 4 Iowa-class battleships, during which time they would strip parts from the North Carolina. In 1982, the prestigious old vessel would be added to the National Register of Historic Places, and in 1986, it would be designated a National Historic Landmark. More recently, as of 2024, the USS North Carolina was recognized as one of North Carolina's most visited tourist attractions, welcoming somewhere in the neighborhood of 250,000 to maybe even 500,000 visitors annually. In the present, BB-55 remains open to the public, offering a wealth of educational materials, tours, events, and more. Now, while none of the hauntings of the USS North Carolina are as defined as some of our other ghost stories in this upload, paranormal activity on board is widely attributed to the ghosts of her former crew members, and both staff and visitors have reported disembodied bootsteps and voices heard from empty spaces, doors that open and close on their own, and instances in which full-bodied apparitions are sighted out of the peripheral, hurrying about, but are always gone when witnesses turn to get a better look. Investigations of the vessel have yielded high EMF levels, chilling EVPs, and hits on thermal grids, while others have told of extreme cold patches felt in adverse weather that move around the ship or even follow tour groups around. Also reported across BB55 are accounts of lights and televisions turning on and off by themselves, objects sighted moving around on their own, and instances in which people have described the sensation of being brushed up against or even touched by someone or something unseen. Possibly the most famous scary story surrounding the North Carolina tells of a soldier that died in the washroom when a torpedo hit somewhere near. It's now believed that the spirit of this soldier, who wasn't quite prepared to leave this world, lingers, and a handful of reports detail encounters with a ghostly man in old-fashioned garb that's covered in brutal wounds and that has even tried to communicate with the living on multiple occasions. And on to number 4, which takes us to the heart of the state and through the North Carolina State Capitol. The North Carolina State Capitol building, which is situated in the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina, is a historic landmark and center of government used to house the state governor and his staff, as well as to host important political meetings. Its bounds have grown in popularity amongst sightseers and history buffs, and in infamy due to their purported slew of paranormal activity and ghostly happenings. Historically, predating our current Capitol building, in 1831, the first North Carolina State House, which was placed right off of Union Square, would burn to the ground in a fire, after which local government would begin designing a new, more modernized Capitol building. Following this lengthy design process, on July 4th of 1833, the cornerstone for our current Greek Revival-style Capitol was laid, with Masonic honors by the Grand Master of North Carolina Masons, one Simmons Jones Baker, and the site would officially open its doors 7 years later in 1840. Following its completion, this new Capitol would host the entirety of the state's government until 1888, after which the Supreme Court and State Library would be moved to a separate building. Sadly, following the Civil War, the Democratic Party, which at the time played host to former Confederates and white supremacists, would run a series of smear campaigns against African American community members and any Caucasian supporters they held. And through the 1890s especially, violence, newspaper propaganda, and race baiting would lead to rising tensions. Disturbingly, in 1898, this long-standing conflict would actually lead to an armed insurrection in Wilmington, in the form of the Wilmington Massacre and Coup, during which a mob of white men marched to the office of a local African-American newspaper, the Daily Record, and set fire to the building, after which this militia would then march through various African-American neighborhoods, severely wounding or outright murdering their inhabitants, until locally elected officials were forced to resign, and were replaced by white supremacists, which would give way to the Jim Crow system. Through the early 20th century, African Americans would fight for rights against the Jim Crow system, while women would band together for suffrage and full political rights. During World War I, and in the absence of many of the region's men, women would step up to fill jobs left by those departing for wars, and suffrage supporters would reorganize into a more official party. Following World War II, civil rights protests would increase pressure, resulting in the federal government eliminating systemic segregation, and tests required for voting that were formerly designed to prohibit certain parties were heavily amended. Subsequently, through the Civil Rights era, the Capitol would act as witness to an assortment of marches and protests, and activists fought for the overturning of Jim Crow laws. And in 1964, Congress would pass the Civil Rights Act, which completely outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, national origin, skin color, sex, or religion in all public areas, while voting, and in both schools and workplaces. In the present, while the Capitol still houses the governor and staff, it also remains an iconic landmark and reminder of the battles we fought for a more civil America. It offers a range of historic displays, plaques, and information, and is open to the public on weekdays from 9 to 5. Now, while nothing monumentally terrible ever really transpired pertaining to the Capitol building directly, ghost stories surrounding its bounds center around the Civil War. And honestly, with the local casualty count, it's really not all that surprising that a good bulk of Raleigh boasts countless tales of paranormal activity. Incidentally, and for many years past, both staff and visitors to the site have reported the sound of marching footsteps and encounters with a host of spectral soldiers clad in Civil War garb. One more popular tale tells of a receptionist, Dutchie Sexsmith, who was working late at night when she heard a commotion on the rotunda that sounded like a large crowd of people hooting and hollering. Unable to concentrate on her work, she locked up her office and started for the exit, but just as she hit the stairs, the noise stopped abruptly, and it became apparent to her that the building was completely empty. Additionally, in 1981, another worker staying late claimed to hear voices coming from a room adjacent to the Senate chamber, and when he went to investigate, he swore he saw a translucent apparition standing there for a moment before fading away. Informal investigations of the capital have yielded high EMF levels, crystal clear EVPs, and hits on spirit boxes, while others have told of the phantom smell of cigar smoke, which is attributed to the ghost of late Governor Zebulon Vance, who was elected in 1862 and again in 1877, and in life was always seemingly smoking his favorite cigars. Another popular and very real story tells of a night watchman named Newell Jackson, who worked the building from the 1920s and onward. Over his tenure, Jackson reported a host of activity, including noises from the empty library, the sounds of doors opening and closing on their own, and even the clatter of breaking glass, which he immediately investigated, only to find every window across the property perfectly intact. Possibly the most chilling of Jackson's reports told of one night when he entered the lobby and watched with a chill as the elevator went up and down of its own accord, as if it was being directed by ghostly passengers. Saving the scariest for last, our fifth and final haunt has us adventuring through the central woodlands of North Carolina and braving the infamous Devil's Tramping Ground. The Devil's Tramping Ground, which is placed out of the unincorporated community of Bear Creek, North Carolina, is a remote, forested campsite near Harper's Crossroads that consists of a barren circle or dead zone seemingly completely void of life, be it plant or animal, that's surrounded by dense woodlands and a mess of trails, and that's grown in both infamy and popularity due to several long-standing legends claiming the area is cursed by Satan himself, who appears there frequently to march around the area on moonlit nights. Historically, some of the first European settlers to arrive to what would one day become Chatham County would get there in the early to mid 18th century and would plant down along the Haw and Eno rivers. By 1771, Chatham County was formed from parts of Orange County, and in 1778, a county seat was designated when the Chatham Courthouse, which would later in 1781 play host to a rather significant engagement in the American Revolution, was constructed, after which, in 1787, the township was renamed as Pittsboro. Notably, around this same time, the Bear Creek Baptist Church was established, thus planting roots for the community of Bear Creek that we know today. While not perfect for large plantation life, over the years, Chatham County would see development under a series of smaller farms where, much like larger operations, slave labor was utilized to produce goods for the profit of their owners. And by 1860, nearly 1/3 of the region's population was enslaved African Americans. Following the Civil War, the county would be filled with freedmen for a time. However, violence against them would increase rapidly, and from the late 1860s and onward, several high-profile terrorist organizations, including the Ku Klux Klan, the Constitutional Union Guard, and the White Brotherhood, would enforce racist laws and would actively work against the progress of African American families locally. Sadly, following the Reconstruction era and into the 20th century, a total of 6 lynchings would transpire across the county, with God knows how many additional acts of hate perpetuated by said groups onto innocent community members, including a mass lynching of 4 African Americans in 1885, who were actually taken from the county jail by a disguised mob at 1 in the morning. Through the early 20th century, the county's coal mines would thrive and would employ a good portion of its populace. However, this industry would wane following the 1925 Coal Glen mine disaster, in which an improperly set blasting charge would result in a total tunnel collapse and in the deaths of at least 53 miners and a handful of work mules. While the industry would soldier on for a time, this incident, coupled with frequent flooding from the deep river, the depth of the coal seam, and faulting of said seam would, by 1953, result in production ceasing entirely. In 1977, Chatham County would adopt a council-manager form of government and would hire a county manager, and more recently, in 2010, the old Chatham County Courthouse would catch fire and would burn to the ground, resulting in a total reconstruction. Today, the whole of Chatham County is still healing from its dark history of racial violence, though it has taken some major progressive steps to change its situation for the better. In more recent years, it's become a popular place for tourism due to its sprawling forests and numerous recreational opportunities, including for campers, hunters, hikers, nature enthusiasts, history buffs, and for those simply seeking a reprieve from busier and much larger metros. Chillingly, the Devil's Tramping Ground has long harbored a sinister reputation which claims that during foggy or stormy weather or on moonlit nights, the King of Hell himself, Lucifer, paces the dead zone while plotting ways to bring his evil into our living world. Incidentally, those who have braved the tramping grounds, especially after dark, and especially when aforementioned conditions are met, have reported sighting demonic beasts in the bushes near, instances of scratches or bruises appearing on their skin without cause, and encounters with Satan himself, who some describe as a horrifying abomination beyond human comprehension, and others as taking the form of an unassuming man. While some stories depict the devil as actually attacking or even hurting those who have neared him, others tell tales of being offered deals in exchange for their everlasting souls. Additionally, those hiking near the circle have described instances in which their dogs refuse to enter or even bark and growl in the direction of its center, while others have told of smelling sulfur, blood, and other unnatural elements that linger in the air. But it's not just the tramping ground itself that hosts supernatural activity, with many believing its dark energy has infected the landscape around. And throughout the forest, across various trails, and near alternate campsites, many have reported ghostly lights that flit amongst the trees, shadowy figures that lurk about, and strange, unidentifiable footsteps heard through the brush. Informal investigations held all throughout the area have yielded high EMF levels, crystal clear EVPs, and disturbing messages given through the use of a Ouija board, while others have told of getting lost due to the forest itself seemingly changing, as if it's trying to keep them there and lead them back to the dead circle. Some more disturbing tales tell of hiking parties who have been followed at great lengths by pale, ghoulish creatures that lumber amongst the trees, while others have reported run-ins with full-bodied apparitions that are bloody and broken, and that are suspected to be victims of the devil or his minions, and a handful of cryptids, some of which, such as wendigo, skinwalkers, and dogmen, can be identified, and others that even cryptozoologists have never even heard of. Lastly, a handful of reports detail ghostly animals that appear from the forest and that have even approached and seemingly attempted to communicate with the living. Interestingly enough, of all the area's manifestations, these are the only ones that are not believed to be nefarious in their intent, and several parties have sworn that, while lost, one of these spirit guides has appeared from nowhere and has actually guided them back to their vehicles and to safety. Thanks for joining me on this journey through some more of North Carolina's most haunted places. If you enjoyed hearing my histories and ghost stories, subscribe to my channel, throw this upload a like, and share me with anyone you feel could use a good scare. I'll see you all next time, and stay spooky.